So, good morning, everyone. My name is Stefan. I'm going to be your host today. I'd like to welcome you to our latest webinar, in which I'm going to talk about my insecurities about the current state of web security. I see people are still joining the webinar. This is a new platform that we're using, and I hope you can see the screen well. I hope you can hear me well. Feel free to complain on the chat. Be aware that all the chat messages are public, and if you have any questions, just drop it there, and we're gonna try to take questions at the end of the session. We have a lot of content to go through, so I'm going to start while people are still joining. What I want to take you through is a little bit of evolution of web security from my point of view. I want to show you some relevant real-world scenarios that we have seen lately. Then I want to discuss about why the web is vulnerable, and in the end, give you some recommendations on how to keep the web presence of your organization safe and secure. So, before we start, just a few words about ourselves. CSIS Group, we were founded in Copenhagen in 2003. We're a security group that are the proud hosts of the Copenhagen Cybercrime Conference, and we were proud to be recently credited by the Gartner Group for our world-known and actionable threat intelligence capabilities. We like to innovate in the security space, and this series of webinars is actually about this, about ideas and about innovation. So thank you all for joining again. As for myself, I'm a security researcher with more than a decade of experience. I'm based in Bucharest, Romania. I joined CSIS last year. Before joining CSIS, I was doing a lot of APT research and automotive security. I was proud to be mentioned by Forbes Romania as an internet doctor for all of the activities done in trying to keep the internet safe. And the reason that I'm talking about web security today is because web security is something that's very close to my heart. Because before starting as a security researcher, I was a web developer. So before learning how to break things, I had the opportunity to learn how to build things. And I think that's something very valuable. So from my point of view, the reason why I became a security researcher was actually because the website that I was managing back when I was young, like when I was in high school, it was hacked. This website was the largest photography website in Romania. I was very passionate about photography, and I was trying to do my best to be a webmaster for this website. And one day, it was 2004 or 2005, if I remember right, I left my home, and the website was looking like this. I mean, yeah, websites back then were much uglier than they are now. But when I came back home, I opened the website, and it looked something like this. There was a hacker based in the Middle East who essentially defaced our nice photography website. This wasn't the exact defacement message that they posted. Unfortunately, I tried to find it, but I couldn't. But this message is very similar to what we saw there. It was a political message that replaced the index page of our website. And this is what usually defacers do. They take advantage of a vulnerability and they just change the index of the website to send a political message. The vulnerability that they exploited in that case, it was a file injection vulnerability. It was actually a remote file inclusion vulnerability. But this type of vulnerabilities, injection vulnerabilities, it can be file injection, remote or local. It can be SQL injection. It can be code injection. These vulnerabilities are almost as old as the World Wide Web. And unfortunately, I don't think these kind of vulnerabilities are going to go away anytime soon. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this famous XKCD comic, but I think it shows a lot about how input filtering is being done in a lot of the web applications that we are using nowadays. So essentially, web applications are becoming more and more complex. And the reason why I think we will never be able to achieve 100% security is because we want all of these innovations. And with more innovation that we want, more modern technology that we want, we're always going to bring back vulnerabilities from the past, and we're always gonna open up new vulnerabilities. So as long as we want to have complex web applications, we have to live with the idea that sooner or later somebody's gonna find a vulnerability in our app. This is a report about the current state of web security published by Hack-and-extort recently. It shows the volume of various vulnerabilities that are present in websites, and you can see the highest volumes are for vulnerabilities that are not necessarily critical, things like cross-site scripting or vulnerable JavaScript libraries. These are the most common ones. But still, things like SQL injection or remote code execution or local file inclusion or directory traversal, even if the volume of these vulnerabilities is relatively low, still 3%, 7%, 4% is a big number. And if such a vulnerability is found in a website, then it's game over for that specific website. This is the picture if you look at the situation right now. But if you look at how things evolved, let's say in the past decade, I think this image says something important. This is the evolution of the OWASP top 10, the top 10 published by the Open Web Application Security Project. And they're trying to evaluate what are the most, let's say, relevant vulnerabilities that security researchers, pen testers, and the people doing audits should look for in their web applications. And you can see that the top 3 vulnerabilities, injection, broken authentication, and cross-site scripting, is essentially the same. Even though the top on the left is from 2013, the top on the right is from 2017, and I'm sure the one that's going to be published next year is going to be more or less the same. So what I want you to remember here is that, unfortunately, the vulnerabilities that we have to manage when talking about web applications, they don't change a lot over time. We're still fighting the same problems that were leaving web applications vulnerable 10 years ago and even 20 years ago. So unfortunately, it seems that we don't really learn from the mistakes of the past. So that's why at the moment, some of the high-profile attacks that you see, most of them, they have some sort of a web component. Maybe you've read the news earlier this week about Honda that had to stop production because they were hit by a ransomware attack. It was a case of the snake ransomware involved. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is that it seems that last year, in 2019, Honda has left an Elasticsearch database exposed to the public. And this was a database containing tens of gigabytes of information related to the inventory of all of their internal systems, servers, endpoints, and the database contained essentially very sensitive data, such as the network topology, what kind of IP addresses they're using, what kind of operating systems they're using, what versions are installed there, and which patches have been applied, right? Even the status of their endpoint security software. This kind of information is very valuable for the attackers. And this is exactly the kind of information that we should avoid. And it's still surprising to me why in the year of 2020, large enterprises, and I'm not trying to single out Honda here because it can happen to anyone. This was just the latest and most fresh example of a large enterprise who doesn't really manage to keep their web inventory safe. So that's the reason why we have a lot of threats, and one of our previous webinars was dedicated to the MageCart threat. It's a threat that's affecting e-commerce. It started affecting, simple websites like Magento or Shopify. But what happened lately is that big enterprise online e-commerce websites are being targeted. Enterprise websites based on Salesforce Commerce Cloud or Demandware. So the problem with web security is starting to reach even the highest level of e-commerce, and that's something that's pretty relevant, especially in the current times. Another thing that we noticed in the past, let's say, 6 months, is that hack-and-extort incidents are on the rise, and they are not necessarily involving, endpoints and Active Directory or Microsoft infrastructure. We're starting to see attackers focusing more and more on hacking and extorting web applications with this new wave of attacks That's essentially what attackers are doing is they're continuously scanning the public internet space, classic web server ports like AD443. And what they try to do is they try to identify weaknesses, logic mistakes in the way that these applications are configured. Most of the times they're looking for low-hanging fruit types of vulnerabilities, but this is usually enough for them to get their foothold inside an organization. So things like databases with weak credentials or with no credentials at all, things like bugs in web applications that can lead to injection types of vulnerabilities. These attacks, they don't start targeted, but they become targeted really quickly. And once the attackers identify a specific vulnerability, they will jump in themselves manually and try to understand what the systems are used for, how can the data be exploited manually. They try to understand the value of the information, and last but not least, they exfiltrate the relevant data before encrypting it or destroying it. This was, of course, always happening, but in many cases, the attackers were just stealing the data and trying to monetize the data by selling it on underground marketplaces. But what's new right now is that attackers are also getting in touch with the victim. They're showing the victim proof that the attack happened. They give the victim, excuse me, they give the victim an exact timeline for how they need to respond, and they ask for ransom, or else all the data becomes public. So this is the new reality that we live in. Attackers are trying to focus on custom-made web applications that are used by companies in various business areas and try to ransom the victims based on vulnerabilities found in these web applications. So if we want to understand how we should solve a problem, we should understand how the problem started. And unfortunately, the problem with the vulnerable World Wide Web started many decades ago, before actually the World Wide Web was invented. So if you look at the history of the internet, you realize that the internet was not meant to be secure. The internet essentially started as a university project, a project between academics that wanted a network that would allow them to share, the results of their academic research in a very quick and timely manner. So the internet was essentially back then a very, let's say, elite network with, with people from universities who all knew each other and all trusted each other. And you have to understand that in that context, protocols which are still being used today, things like TCP/IP or FTP or the World Wide Web that was invented by Tim Berners, all of these protocols, they started back in that day where essentially everyone on the internet knew each other. It was like a small family, and they didn't design these protocols with security in mind. They wouldn't think that somebody would want to trick somebody else into doing something. So if you fast forward to the current day, that's why we have the current state of the web, in which everything is so complex and we're still carrying with us technologies from 10, 20, even 30 years ago. And that's actually one of my main frustrations. It's not, let's say, a security issue, but I think it's an issue of modern websites, which is the fact that this screenshot is a screenshot of the inspect element in my Chrome browser, the network tab, that shows all of the requests when I load a web page of my favorite news website, right? So if I want to read some news, my browser needs to make 400 requests and transfer more than 10 megabytes of information. It's something that takes more than 10 seconds to happen just so I could read some news titles, right? And if I actually want to read the news article, I need to click the article, and then there's going to be even more requests and even more megabytes of information. So I think this is a little bit counterintuitive, because even though in the last 10 years, the internet connections that we're using have gotten, roughly 20 times faster, the load pages of the websites have stayed the same. So this gives me, the idea that we're definitely making some bad decisions when it comes to our web applications. Sometimes it's just bad design. We want to bloat a lot of things in there. Sometimes we take inefficient shortcuts because it's just easier to develop something less efficiently. Many times we want to have backwards compatibility, so that's what makes our code even more bloated and even more vulnerable. And we have a very fast development life cycle where the business always wants improvements in the applications, and there's never time or resources to prioritize efficiency or, even more importantly, security. Right. So if we talk about security specifically, unfortunately, the software is never going to be secure. So Moore's law that says that performance is doubling and doubling all the time, unfortunately, doesn't allow us to have better security or better usability. And you can see this not only in the World Wide Web, but you can see this in all of the technologies that we're using around us. GSM, that we rely our mobile communications on, is a 20 years old technology, and we just keep adding G's on top of it, 3G, 4G, 5G, and so on. There's satellites launched into orbit 30 years ago, which are still providing unencrypted internet access, and they're still being used until they will reach end of life. Amadeus ticket system for air ticketing is still being used by air companies nowadays. And of course, last but not least, SWIFT, which is 50 years old, and it's a very basic system that banks and financial institutions nowadays are still used to settle international transactions. I think this is our, let's say, curse of the evolution of technology, that because we want backwards compatibility, we're taking vulnerabilities and mistakes that happened in the past and bad decision designs that we had to take in the past when we didn't have a crystal ball to see how the internet is going to evolve. And we take all of these technologies and move forward with them, creating a current state in which everything is pretty vulnerable. And sometimes we tend to blame the developers, because if a software application has bugs, maybe it's the developer fault. I would say it's a yes and no. I would say the fault should be divided 50-50 between the developers and the businesses that ask them to develop what they're developing. There's definitely a lack of security education all around. For example, when I learned how to do programming more than 10 years ago, nobody would teach me how to do programming in a secure way. All the focus when you were studying computer science would have been to create efficient algorithms that would solve a problem, but not algorithms that would sustain, weird input data or active exploit attempts. Of course, especially in outsourcing shops and development shops, there's always the classic problem of low budgets, people who are overworked, teams who are overstaffed, multiple projects running at the same time, moving people from one project to another. And of course, all this adds up to a suboptimal state of security. There's always, from the business side, requirements for new features, and most of the time the focus is only based on functionality and business logic. It's never about security, and most of the time security is being seen as a nuisance, as something that, yeah, we have to do, but there's definitely a lack of proactiveness there. And there's this attitude that security should come later as an add-on. Let's just develop the application, let's make it functional, and then we'll just put some security on top of it. And unfortunately, that's not how security works. You have to think about security from the first steps of designing an application, whether it's a web application or a software application. And I think if more pressure would come from the customers, from the businesses that are actually paying developers to develop the web applications, I think more focus would be put in this area. So with this in mind, and looking at the long-term history of the web and the current state of affairs, I think that some specific recommendations are in place if we want our web properties to be secure. And one of the things that I like to do is I like to look at the world of safecrackers and try to draw some conclusions there. Because safecrackers more or less have the same culture as security people, only they had to solve the, let's say, philosophical problems of their work 100 years before we have to solve these problems. So if you look at Matt Blaze's paper, Safecracking for the Computer Scientist, you will notice that safecrackers have a very good way of measuring how secure is a safe. First of all, they will never say that the safe is 100% secure, because they know for a fact that any kind of safe can be broken sooner or later. So the way they measure the level of security of a safe is by calculating how much time an attacker, a resourceful attacker, would need in order to successfully get access to the contents of the safe. And I think we should learn from this theory, because applying it to computer systems, I think we would have a lot to gain if we would just assume for a fact that any computer system can be hacked, and we would just base our defensive strategy in making the hack or the attack as expensive as possible for the attacker. So if you look at how websites get hacked, for example, in the case of MageCart, I won't go into technical details here, but the idea is that the attacker either exploit a vulnerability in the web application itself, but also third-party plugin vulnerabilities, which is the supply chain attack that we're focusing more and more on lately. They're abusing also the human side of things, like humans choosing weak admin credentials. And of course, they interconnect with other areas of cybercrime, especially abusing endpoint malware to steal credentials and to access the admin panels of these websites. It doesn't have to be an online shop to be attractive for cyber criminals. Any kind of web property can get hacked. But what I want you to remember here is that the essence of compromise is time. This is exactly what we learned from safecrackers, and I think this is something that we shouldn't forget, because an attack will never happen in an instant. Your website will not get hacked with just one request, one malicious request. The attackers, they need to do reconnaissance. They need to understand what kind of software it's running there and how the application is working. This usually takes time. It can take days or even weeks to do recon. Then they will have to run automated tools that again will generate lots of requests. And only then, in the end, when they actually do the remote code execution or the SQL injection, that doesn't take much time. But the idea is that before the attack is successful, any kind of attacker will generate a lot of noise. And I think we could use this in our own advantage only if we would be aware of what our web properties are, and if we would continuously monitor alerts and logs and activity on these web properties. So my idea of a defensive strategy is to, of course, expect the best, but to be prepared for the worst. And to base your threat model on multiple protection layers, and not just talking about technical protection layers, but also policy, like how you handle vulnerability disclosure, and maybe you have a bug bounty program, or maybe you do some continuous auditing. But the essence of the strategy is that it has to cost the attacker time in order to compromise you, so that he would just go away and decide to compromise somebody else's website. And of course, it's also a question of money. Maybe an attack against your organization will be much more expensive, thus making it not worthwhile to go forward with. So as attackers have very simple math, they analyze the cost of the attack, and they look at the reward that they get if the attack is successful, or the damage that they get if the attack is a failure. I think we as defenders should do the same thing. And one of the most misconceptions that we're seeing when dealing with small and medium businesses, but also enterprises sometimes, is that there's a lot of focus on being compliant. There's a lot of focus on things like ISOs or PCI compliance, or GDPR regulations. But the reality is that hackers will never care if your organization is compliant with these things. You can pass all of the security audits in the world, but if you have an Elasticsearch database exposed to the internet, or a custom web application with some SQL injection in it, attackers will not care about that. The good news is that let's say not all hackers are bad. So there will be bad hackers that will exploit your web application and try to make money out of that, try to extort you into paying money. But there's also more and more white hat hackers, more and more people involved in things like bug bounties. And these are people who, they will report a vulnerability if they're going to find it. But the thing is, you have to have a policy in place. You have to acknowledge the vulnerability. You have to be able to quickly estimate the impact, to communicate all of these things with the researcher that discovered the vulnerability, to be ready to publicly disclose the vulnerability, and last but not least, why not even reward the researcher? These are a few of the questions that, a few of the worries that a security researcher might have when disclosing vulnerabilities, like things that you need to make sure that you have set in place, that there's an easy way for them to get in contact with the company. On the website, you should have very clearly stated where people should get in touch with you to report security vulnerabilities. If these vulnerabilities are reported, of course, you should communicate with them. You shouldn't ignore. You shouldn't ignore them, because if they feel that they are ignored, they would feel that maybe the vulnerability needs to become public, and no organization wants to have, let's say, an uncoordinated response vulnerability disclosure process. And last but not least, like I said, be ready to reward these people. It doesn't have to be money. Of course, lots of big companies are going after bug bounty programs where they actually pay security researchers in a crowdsourced way big amounts of money for discovering vulnerabilities. But there's other solutions as well that could help acknowledge the help of such researchers. And after dealing with this, after having a public process in place, of course, this is still not enough. You have to understand your own web ecosystem. And if, let's say, 10 years ago, it was pretty clear that there weren't so many technologies that you could use to develop web applications. Right now, web technologies are getting more and more fragmented, meaning that there will be fewer developers and fewer security specialists that could look at all kinds of web applications. So you need to know exactly what kind of code you're running, what kind of software is there, what kind of technology stack your web applications are running on. So how I would start is I would start by, of course, looking at the supply chain. And when I'm talking about the supply chain, I'm not just talking about software that your organization buys, but I would look very closely to the software that is being customly tailored made for your organization. Make sure that you have a web property inventory put in place where critical assets are identified and relevant actions are prioritized in case of various web security incident scenarios. I would pay special attention to the external web properties, things like online shops, business-to-business portals, marketing websites, because many of these, they might be running old code bases, they might be missing updates, or they might be missing completely from the inventory list. I will try to look at the business risk and try to analyze that in accordance to the threat model that I'm trying to prepare for. And this is just to help prioritize different risks. Some general recommendations that I think are worth following is to be especially careful, as I mentioned, with custom web applications, because these are often overlooked in corporate environments. Minimizing web attack surface is something that's very relevant, and especially when working with third-party suppliers. This shouldn't be your job as a customer. This should be the job of a third-party supplier. But because of the whole list of problems, with overstuffing and understaffing and under budgeting, I think that the customer should push the third-party supplier to take care of things like minimizing the web attack surface, things like hardening the infrastructure, properly configuring firewall permissions, and lowest privilege for any kind of application that is running out there. So my message here is to take responsibility in your own hands, meaning that if you're working with suppliers, try to organize them and try to raise the bar of security that they are required to make, right? Try to raise their standards, because you as a customer, you're paying for those services, so you have all the right to receive, secure web applications. And before we end, I think a very big focus should be put on continuously improving your web posture, right? The security of web applications is not something that you do once and then forget about it. And unfortunately, in the web development world, this is the most common attitude. Like, you do a pen test before you make an application public, and that's it. I think that periodic design reviews should be conducted that would help always keep an updated risk and threat model for your business. I think that security audits should also be performed periodically because web applications, they evolve, technologies, they evolve, and also exploits and vulnerabilities, they evolve. So doing this in the first place will provide you a baseline from which to grow, but then continuing to do that over and over again will help stay on top of the threats. And last but not least, and I think this is something that's mostly overlooked by most of the organizations that I've worked with directly, which is to implement a centralized log collection system for the web applications. Companies are doing this for other things, but many of the times nobody looks at the logs of the web application. And thinking of the fact that no attack happens in a second, attackers need days, weeks, even months in order to launch a successful attack. I think that more than 90% of the web attacks that we're seeing could be stopped only if somebody would actually be proactive and look at the logs of each web application and monitor those logs for suspicious behavior. So in conclusion, I think that we live in a world in which the web is definitely vulnerable. The current state of things is not going to change soon. As I showed you, we're still dealing with vulnerabilities that started showing up a decade or 2 decades ago, and they're still not going away. At the same time, cybercrime is becoming more sophisticated. Attackers are having bigger budgets and bigger, let's say, resources to use in attacking our web applications. At the same time, technologies are getting more fragmented, which means that it's harder to manage everything from one place and to have only one specialist that knows how to do everything. Things are getting especially more complicated with the supply chain attacks being on the rise. So you as a CISO in an organization, you not only have to take care of your own security, but you also have to keep pushing your suppliers to increase the level of their security. Unfortunately, compliance is not enough. Compliance is probably the least you can do in order to achieve a better web security posture. And what's needed, I think, is to be proactive in defending the web properties and to try to have the good hackers on your side, meaning being friendly with the white hat hacking community and trying to get some of the good hackers on your side. And I think that the CSIS group, we can really be there for you with this. So I'd like to thank you so much for following. Make sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter and other social media channels to stay in touch with our latest webinars and publications. And I'd like to thank you for paying attention today, to let you know that this webinar is going to be recorded, because I see there's a question about being recorded. And yes, the session is recorded, and I think everyone who registered is going to receive the recording. I see there's no questions. If anyone wants to ask anything, now is the time. If not, I encourage you to follow myself on Twitter, to follow CSIS Group, to get in touch with us. We try to always be active in the community, to contribute, to give back, because we also take a lot from the community. And at the end of the day, we are all the good guys being on the same side and trying to fight the lack of security on the internet. So with all of this, thank you so much for paying attention. Thank you for joining our session. Have a great Friday and a great weekend, and hope to see you soon at one of our future webinars. All the best.